Hi, my name's Oliver Waters and welcome to Waters and Acland Furniture Workshop and Fine Furniture School. This video is being created in support of a series of articles that we're writing during 2015 called the Apprentice Notes. The articles are based on notes taken by one of our former students, Jim Cooper, and they detail techniques and projects undertaken by students who spend time within our furniture school. The first task that is undertaken by any student, whether they're here for a week, 3 months, 6 months or even a full year, is to prepare a hand plane for use. The first part of that is to flatten the hand plane. Now planes do come pretty flat from the leading manufacturers these days, but when you're aiming for perfection, when you want total control of the shavings, good feedback which allows us to teach accurate furniture making, we feel it's worth going that extra mile to flatten that sole a little further. Now Graham Loveridge, the head tutor within the furniture school, will demonstrate exactly how we do that. As you can see, Graham's using a thick bit of glass for this part of the process. This is 50mm glass and it's non-toughened glass. Toughened glass actually isn't flat, whereas float glass, non-toughened glass, is inherently flat. We clamp this lightly to a flat bench. The light clamping is to avoid any flex to being introduced into the glass. And as you can see, Graham's just using a couple of little bits of cork to protect that as he lightly clamps it to the bench. When we first tried this process, we actually used 10mm glass and found that if that was used on a non-flat surface, that flex could be introduced into the glass, which won't give us the flatness that we require. So the next part of this process is to clean the surface, make sure that there's nothing left on the surface from the previous time it was used. None of the adhesive, the sticky adhesive that really can stick down and be difficult to remove. We use shellac thinners to clean that surface to make sure that there's no dust or particles that could get trapped underneath the abrasive sheets and therefore knock the surface out of flat. And you can see Graham pays a lot of attention to this. He makes sure that the surface is completely clean before he starts applying the sheets of abrasive. Okay, so we've got a nice flat surface now, and before we even start the process of flattening the sole of a plane, certainly a new plane that's from one of the leading manufacturers, which of course will cost a lot of money, the first thing we do is actually inspect the plane, because if it's too far out of flat, we probably would suggest that that's either swapped out with the supplier or returned to the manufacturer. So we're just using a 0.2mm feeler gauge as a rough rule of thumb. And if that can go underneath the plane whilst it's on the float glass any more than, let's say, 5mm, there would be a suggestion that that's going to take too long to flatten. It's going to be too expensive in terms of the lapping film. So again, talk to your supplier, see if they can swap it out, exchange it for one that maybe is a little closer to flat to begin with. So if your plane is within those tolerances, it's time to start thinking about flattening that sole. The first thing we do is apply the actual 3M micro finishing film or lapping film to the float glass. This isn't an easy process. It does take skill and follow Graham's lead here and you'll get that right. The first thing to do is to apply the front edge of the lapping film only, maybe the first sort of 5-10mm. Do this carefully so it's squared up to the piece of glass so you don't wander off the glass as you're applying 3 sheets in this process. And we use this veneer roller to make sure there are no bubbles and to get a firm bond down onto the glass. Again, you get that front edge and then you come around the other side and you grip the actual sheet that's protecting the abrasive, and as you slowly peel that down, you use that veneer roller to make sure that there are absolutely no bubbles underneath the surface of the lapping film. Again, you can see that Graham does this very carefully, very meticulously. It's an important part of this process because it wants to be flat, you don't want bubbles. Here we're doing multiple sheets. Again, it's very important with the multiple sheets that you apply it without bubbles. It's also important that there's a very small gap and certainly no overlap between the sheets. If you do get any bubbles, it's not too serious. You just get a scalpel, nick the bubble, use the veneer roller to get rid of that bubble, and then you're flat and ready to go. So having prepared the grinding surface, what Graham's now going to show you is just the application of a grid pattern across the sole of the plane. He just uses a felt tip pen and marks up neatly a consistent grid pattern across the entire sole of the plane. This grid pattern is what we're going to use to analyse the sole of the plane after it's been ground on the abrasive. The grid pattern in combination with the scratch pattern that's developed by the abrasive will tell us the areas which aren't flat and how much more work we need to do in order to get to that perfect flatness that we're after. So having prepared our grinding surface and having marked up the sole of the plane with that grid pattern, it's now time to actually start the grinding. And Graham will just take a few passes to start with in order that we can analyse the grid pattern and see where we are to start with. And as you can see on the sole of this Quangsheng number 5, the scratch pattern is on the toe and on the heel, which is suggestive of a hollow across the main body of the plane. So we'll take that a little bit further, which will give us an indication of how serious that hollow is and how much time we're going to have to spend at the flattening station in order to get the flatness that we desire. So we take another look at the sole and we can see actually that the scratch pattern is progressing quite quickly from the toe and the heel and also along the edges of the plane, which is suggestive that that hollow is actually very shallow and that we should be able to remove it fairly quickly. So again, as we move forward, we start to increase the number of strokes that we do before inspection, and the next time we have a look, we are hoping that that scratch pattern is moving in and that grid pattern is getting smaller and smaller. And after only a couple of minutes, we can see that that is progressing quite nicely and that the plane must have been pretty flat straight out of the box. As we move through the process of grinding the sole of the plane, we do use a lubricant. In this case, it's a non-water-based lubricant, GT85. We start to increase the number of strokes between inspection. We now might be up to 10 minutes between the inspections of the sole, and we will hope to see that that grid pattern becomes increasingly small and follows the same pattern. And if you look closely here, you'll see that the grid pattern is still there. It's still in that central area in the main body of the sole. It's starting to move away from the mouth, which is very important, and it appears now to be covering only maybe 30% of the sole of the plane. So we're edging towards a point where we'd be happy to start using that plane. Again, liberal application of the lubricant and more strokes. Now if you look closely at the way Graham does this, it's a very light approach. His body is introduced into the stroke as little as possible. He's using the weight of the plane to do the work very consistently and using the entire surface of the abrasive. We're probably about an hour into this grinding process now, and when you inspect the plane at this stage, you can see that that grid pattern has virtually disappeared. It's still there, and you can see that it's moving away from the mouth and that it's just in that central area, so we're getting very close to the point at which we'll stop. Maybe another 10-20 minutes and we'll have a last inspection and just check that that grid pattern has moved away from the mouth and that the vast majority of the sole of the plane is flat. And if you look closely as we slow down the video, you can just make out the grid pattern just in that central area. You can see that the mouth is free and that the rest of the sole of the plane is completely flat. And it's at this point that we'd recommend that you probably stop. The plane will work perfectly. It'll give us that perfect flat reference for when we're creating shavings and teaching planing techniques at the really highest level. So that's the serious job done. The sole of the plane is now flat and off in use, creating some beautiful shavings. There's just one more job to do, however, and that's to remove those adhesive sheets. If they've been left any amount of time, they're going to get stuck down really firmly, but in this case, Graham's just going to peel these off fairly easily because they've only been bonded to the glass for an hour or two. The window scraper comes in really handy when they are stuck more firmly in actually physically scraping off the adhesive, and also we use shellac thinners again, often quite liberally, to remove the adhesive that's stuck on the glass and prepare that piece of glass for the next user and for the next time you need to flatten the sole of a plane. Thanks for joining us here at Waters and Acland Furniture Workshop. I hope you enjoyed the video. It's the first of a series of videos that we're going to produce in conjunction and support of a series of articles that we're writing for Furniture and Cabinetmaking Magazine called the Apprentice Notes series. The next in the series is going to focus again using the Scary Sharp system, but this time we're going to use that for preparing the blade for use and in particular for flattening the back of the plane blade. So join us soon and we'll walk you through that process.